They called it the cradle of reason, the birthplace of philosophy, the light that guided the Western world out of darkness. But beneath that light, shadows writhed. Beneath marble columns and golden temples, another Greece breathed, one that the poets never sang of and the philosophers never questioned. A Greece that sanctified pleasure and pain in the same altar, that offered bodies instead of prayers, that found divinity not in the heavens but in the trembling flesh of the condemned. In the narrow alleys behind the theatres of Dionysus, where actors performed the tragedies of gods and kings, a different play was staged every night. The audience did not clap, it moaned. The performers were not celebrated, they were broken. These rituals, carved into the very soul of the Hellenic world, were acts of worship so brutal that even the gods they honoured might have turned their faces away. The Greeks believed that pleasure was a pathway to truth, that ecstasy, divine madness, was a form of revelation. In the name of the god of wine, the god of fertility, the god of excess, they blurred the border between holiness and horror. The Dionysian festivals began as processions filled with music and laughter, but by nightfall the laughter curdled. Torches glowed red against stone, drums beat like thunder, wine poured like blood. And then began the part no historian dared to record. Women chosen for the ceremony were led to the temple in veils, so thin they seemed made of smoke. Some were priestesses, others slaves, others captives from distant lands brought as offerings. Their fate was the same. The crowd chanted as they were tied to pillars or laid upon cold altars, their bodies painted with oil and ash. The priests called it the marriage of flesh and divinity, the moment when the god entered the human realm. But the god never came, only men wearing masks of ivy and horns, drunk on power and prophecy. At the heart of Athens stood the temple of Dionysius Eleutherius, the liberator they called him. Inside its subterranean chambers, the liberator's rites chained more souls than any prison. Archaeologists would later find iron rings embedded in the walls, channels cut in the stone to drain away the blood, small amphorae filled with what once was honey, wine, and the residue of human tears, each symbol a whisper from a past too monstrous to forget. They said the suffering of women purified the city. Each scream was an offering, each wound a prayer. When the priest raised the ceremonial blade, he did not strike to kill. Not yet. The edge grazed the skin, enough to draw blood but not to end life. That blood was mixed with wine and poured onto the altar. The crowd would drink it, believing it carried the blessing of Dionysus himself. In those moments, madness became holiness. The gods were fed, the people were cleansed, and the victims disappeared into the silence that followed. Outside, Athens continued its philosophical debates about virtue and justice. Plato spoke of the ideal forms, Socrates questioned the meaning of truth, Aristotle dissected morality, all within earshot of temples that echoed with cries, yet none of them mentioned the rituals that financed their golden age. The state collected taxes on every body offered, every act performed in the sanctified brothels called pornotelia. The coins minted with Athena's face carried the scent of sweat and blood, circulating through the markets like cursed relics of pleasure. The most terrifying rituals were those disguised as celebrations. During the spring festivals, when flowers bloomed and the air smelled of rebirth, Athens held the rites of fertility. Virgins were chosen, sometimes daughters of noblemen, sometimes slaves bought from the docks. They were brought to the fields outside the city, crowned with garlands, and placed before wooden idols smeared with wine and ashes. The priest declared that the earth demanded union, that to ensure the harvest, a human offering must feel the touch of both God and man. The ritual ended only when the victim could no longer move, and the soil beneath her was dark and wet. By dawn, the participants washed themselves in the river, singing hymns to purity. Not every ritual was public. Some belonged to secret cults hidden in caves or mountain shrines. The followers of Cybele, the mother goddess, believed in the sacred mutilation. Men who sought to please her would dance until frenzy overtook them, then castrate themselves with sharp stones before collapsing into her embrace. Their screams echoed through the night like animal howls, a chorus of pain mistaken for devotion. The women who served the goddess painted their faces with the blood of these men, calling it the colour of life. In that moment, agony and ecstasy became one. The Greeks were obsessed with the balance of opposites, order and chaos, beauty and terror, love and death. Their rituals reflected that belief to its darkest extreme. The most beautiful temples were built over the most dreadful pits. The most eloquent prayers were whispered over the fainting bodies of the condemned. And when dawn came, the same hands that had held the whip offered flowers at the altar. The city awoke, pretending nothing had happened. One account, preserved in fragments of lost plays, describes a ceremony held in honour of Aphrodite Pandemos, the goddess of common love. At her festival, men and women of all classes were invited to indulge in the union of bodies without restraint. But among them were always slaves brought to satisfy the desires of the elite. For 3 nights the city surrendered to lust. When the fires burned out and the incense faded, those who had served as offerings were led away in silence. Some disappeared forever. The poets called it the cleansing of the polis, a purge through passion. Centuries later, when scholars tried to piece together the truth, they dismissed these stories as exaggerations, myths twisted by time. But the ruins spoke differently. In Corinth, excavations uncovered small rooms beneath the temple of Aphrodite, each with a single stone bench, an iron ring, and traces of olive oil mixed with blood. In Crete, frescoes showed masked figures performing acts that no prayer could justify. And in the island of Lesbos, a grave of 20 women was found, all young, all bound at the wrists. The inscriptions on nearby stones mentioned only one phrase: for the favour of the gods. The horror was systematic, ritualized, and sanctified. It was not crime, it was ceremony. To the Greeks, the line between worship and violation did not exist. Both were acts of devotion. The body was a vessel for the divine, and breaking it was a way to reach godhood. Those who survived the rites were celebrated as touched by the divine. Those who died were buried without names, their bones later mistaken for sacrificial animals. But perhaps the most chilling truth was this: these rituals were not confined to distant temples or mountain caves. They happened in the very heart of the cities we now romanticize: Athens, Corinth, Delphi. The same marble steps where philosophers walked were once slick with the offerings of ritual blood. The same amphitheatres that echoed with plays of virtue had once echoed with the cries of those who had no voice. The world remembers Greece for its beauty, its art, its philosophy. Few remember the screams that built its foundations. Every marble column hides a stain. Every statue of a god, no matter how graceful, once demanded a price, and every hymn of glory was sung to drown the sound of suffering. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the rituals had become more organized, more profitable. Temples employed record keepers, tax collectors, and guards. The priests became administrators of desire, transforming faith into economy. The state protected them, the people worshipped them, the victims vanished into history. Even those who questioned morality, the thinkers, the poets, fell silent when confronted with the truth. Because to challenge the rituals was to challenge the gods themselves, and so Greece perfected the art of sanctified cruelty. It made pain holy, lust divine, and silence sacred. That is the Greece the marble never shows, the Greece the textbooks forgot. Yet its echoes survive, in the myths we tell, in the symbols we carve, in the temples we still visit, blinded by admiration. The question that lingers is not how such rituals existed, but why we chose to forget them. Perhaps because it is easier to worship the beauty of ruins than to confront the horror that built them. As centuries passed, Greece changed its rulers but not its gods. Empires rose and fell, but the rituals remained, evolving with time, shifting shapes, wearing new masks, yet always feeding on the same ancient hunger. The temples became richer, the ceremonies more elaborate, and the victims more invisible. The paradox was perfect. The land that gave birth to democracy also perfected the ritual of domination. At the height of Athens' power, the priests of Dionysius and Aphrodite competed for influence. To the citizens they promised prosperity and divine favour. To the victims they offered only pain disguised as salvation. The grand festivals of the city were no longer just spiritual gatherings. They were economic engines. Each sacrifice, each sacred act, had a price, and the state collected its due. When the procession of Dionysus began, musicians filled the streets with flutes and drums. Crowds chanted hymns, men wore masks of beasts and gods, and behind the glittering chaos, slaves led the chosen women through hidden corridors toward the inner sanctum. There, amid torchlight and the scent of burning resin, the transformation took place. The women were stripped, their bodies painted with sacred patterns, symbols of fertility, rebirth, and submission. Some were forced to drink wine laced with herbs that blurred the mind and numbed the senses. Others were bound to stone slabs, their cries swallowed by the chanting. When the high priest appeared, his face covered by a golden mask of Dionysus, the ritual began. He declared that in surrendering their flesh, the women opened the gates between man and God, and then, as the crowd roared outside, he proved it, with the blade, the whip, or his own body. What followed was not passion but performance, an act meant to appease the watching gods and the cheering mortals. The ritual always ended with the same silence, bodies left on cold marble, eyes staring blankly at ceilings painted with celestial scenes. The priests called it union, the victims called it death in slow motion. For the men of Athens, participation in these rites was a mark of devotion, not shame. They believed that through controlled madness, through ritual excess, they purified their souls and their city. The philosophers rationalized it as the pursuit of divine truth through physical experience. The poets turned it into metaphor, and the artists immortalized it in marble, not as horror but as beauty. Statues of naked goddesses and ecstatic nymphs lined the temples, frozen in perfect pleasure, their pain erased, their stories buried beneath layers of idealized form. But some fragments escaped censorship. In the ruins of Corinth, archaeologists unearthed clay tablets inscribed with faint letters, records of temple transactions. One line reads simply, "For the service of the goddess, 3 slaves delivered, 2 returned." Another tablet lists the price of initiation offerings, wine, incense, linen ropes, and oil. These were not metaphors. They were inventories of ritualized violence. Even the sacred theatre, the pride of Greek culture, played its part. During the festivals of Dionysus, tragedies were performed to mirror the human condition. But outside the stage, real tragedies unfolded, sanctioned by the same god. While actors recited verses about fate and justice, the priests nearby prepared the night's offerings. The audience applauded art while ignoring the suffering that made it possible. The irony was perfect, the hypocrisy divine. Not all gods demanded pain. Some required endurance, others humiliation. In the cult of Priapus, the god of virility, men offered their wives or slaves in public rituals of fertility. Statues of Priapus, grotesquely exaggerated, stood at the centre of gardens and marketplaces. Women were compelled to kneel before them, touching the stone idol as the priest recited hymns of fecundity. The ritual was said to bless their wombs, but for many it brought only shame. Ancient graffiti found near one such temple reads, "We came as worshippers, we left as ghosts." Perhaps the most disturbing of all were the mysteries, secret rites of Eleusis and Samothrace, where the line between enlightenment and violation blurred beyond recognition. Initiates swore to never reveal what they witnessed inside the sacred halls. Those who broke their vow were executed. But ancient whispers tell of feasts where wine flowed like rivers, where masks hid more than faces, where the screams of initiation blended with chants of salvation. Some scholars later suggested that what the Greeks called divine revelation may have been the echoes of ritual abuse sanctified by secrecy. Still, the temples flourished. Offerings poured in. Gold adorned the altars. The more the city decayed in morals, the richer the sanctuaries became. The priests spoke of purity, yet their wealth was measured in the suffering they concealed. Even the oracles, women chosen to speak for the gods, were not spared. The most famous of them, the Pythia of Delphi, sat above a fissure that released intoxicating vapours. Her body trembled, her voice distorted as she delivered cryptic prophecies. But many accounts reveal that the trance was induced not by divinity, but by exhaustion, deprivation, and forced intoxication. The gods did not speak through her, men did. By the late classical era, foreign visitors to Greece began to whisper their unease. Roman envoys wrote in private journals about festivals of flesh and frenzy. Yet even they, heirs of empire and blood, could not comprehend how the land of philosophy could justify such cruelty in the name of faith. But for the Greeks, the explanation was simple. Their gods were human, and humans divine. To hurt, to desire, to dominate, these were reflections of the cosmos itself. And so the rituals continued, until the marble began to crack. The Peloponnesian War drained Athens of its wealth and its soul. Temples once overflowing with offerings stood silent. The priests still performed the rites, but the crowds grew smaller, the faith weaker. Yet even as the empire decayed, the same altars drank the same blood. It was as if the gods refused to die without one final feast. When Christianity finally reached Greece, its missionaries were horrified. They found shrines littered with bones, carvings of erotic agony, chambers still stained dark with centuries of offerings. The new religion condemned these acts as demonic, yet the echoes of the old rites did not vanish. They merely changed form. The festivals of fertility became carnivals of excess. The sacred brides became saints and martyrs. The sacrifices transformed into metaphors. But the instinct remained, the urge to find salvation through suffering, to seek divinity through the body's destruction. Modern historians often struggle to reconcile the Greece of philosophers with the Greece of blood. They separate the two, pretending that one was born despite the other. But truth is less comforting. The same minds that built the Parthenon designed the rituals. The same logic that reasoned about virtue also justified cruelty. Civilization and savagery were not opposites in Greece. They were twins. Today, when tourists walk through the ruins of Athens, they see elegance and perfection, not the shadows that cling to the stones. They admire the symmetry of the columns, unaware that each one hides a ledger of pain. They praise the wisdom of Socrates, forgetting that his world found enlightenment in the screams of the enslaved. The temples are silent now, but silence is not peace. It is concealment. Beneath the marble lies the memory of every ritual, every sacrifice, every body that was offered and forgotten. If you listen closely, beyond the hum of the crowds and the chatter of guides, you can almost hear them, faint, distant, but undeniable. The whispers of women who were called sacred only so they could be desecrated. The gasps of men who mistook madness for godliness. The echoes of a civilization that could build beauty from bones. The Greeks believed that gods never die. They simply change their names. Perhaps they were right. The rituals of domination, the worship of pleasure over compassion, the sanctification of violence, they survive, reshaped for modern altars. We no longer call them sacrifices, but the essence remains. The ancient hunger still breathes behind closed doors, behind industries, behind the facades of progress. History may have buried the temples, but not the instinct that built them. This is the unspoken legacy of ancient Greece. Not only the poetry of Homer or the logic of Aristotle, but the cries of those erased from their pages. It is a civilization that taught us to admire perfection, while ignoring the cost of creating it. And if you feel unease, you should. Because the past is not gone. It waits beneath the stones, whispering truths we still refuse to face. So remember, when you gaze upon the ruins glowing under the Mediterranean sun, you're not just looking at history, you are standing upon it. Every column, every frieze, every broken statue was paid for in flesh. And sometimes, the most beautiful civilizations are simply the most perfected disguises of horror. Because civilizations don't die from conquest. They die from corruption. From the moment they forget the humanity that birthed them. Ancient Greece was not destroyed by its enemies. It was devoured by the same gods it created, by rituals that fed on its soul until nothing divine remained. The stones of the Parthenon still gleam white, but their shadow is black as eternity. And if you ever stand there in the heart of Athens, listen. The wind that sweeps through the ruins does not whisper of glory. It carries the breath of those who beg to be remembered.